Welcome to Shelf Talkers, a podcast from Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Shelf Talkers podcast by Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. These bookshelves talk to us, and we're going to explore just how they do that through interviews with our authors and our guests here at Village Well on Culver and Duquesne. Your hosts are Julia and Jared, both booksellers here at Village Well. You want to say hello, Julia?
Hey guys, it's great to be here. I love reading.
We both love reading.
I like being in Culver City reading.
That is the primary purpose of this podcast, to combine those two facts. We love reading and we love being in downtown Culver City. Today's guest is the newly published author Colin Hinckley, here to discuss the writing and content of his new book, The Black Lord, a horror novella published by Tenebris Press. We're going to jump into that interview. Hello, Colin. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you.
Let's just point out that Colin also is a bookseller with us at the Village Well, and we're so happy to have you as our first guest. It's serendipitous, honestly. It's great.
We love how much you're able to fill out the horror section at the store. And technically speaking, Colin is both of our bosses, so we're really making sure that this podcast is as amicable and, incredibly flattering for Colin as possible for everybody's benefit.
Yes, if I don't come off good, you're both fired.
Yeah, you have that authority.
And listeners don't have the Shelf Talkers as a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that would be the biggest bummer of it all.
All right, so I'll start. Our first question for all of our guests is, please write a shelf talker for your book.
Sure. You know that feeling you had when you were a kid? When you're lying in your bed at night and you're certain that something is moving at your window, or your closet door is open, or there's maybe something rustling under your bed? That is the feeling I was trying to capture with The Black Lord. This feeling of just absolute childhood dread that there is something lurking outside your window and it's coming for you. So that was the impetus for the story, and that's how it came to be. And yeah.
As a kid, was that a feeling you experienced a lot that led to this being a fascination for over the years?
Sure. I was a really scared kid, honestly. I avoided any sort of horror for the first 10 or 11 years of my life. This book actually came about because of a dream that I had when I was a kid. I had a dream that there was something tapping at my window, but I didn't actually see it. So it was kind of this thing that was rolling around in my head for a long time. Like, what was it? What was tapping at my window? And this book was kind of an effort to figure out what it was. Unexpected. I didn't expect this thing to be the thing at my window.
The monster you discovered. That's awesome.
So this is also a story about family and a story about grief. So the way you write is so sensory and so experiential, but what is the story of the Black Lord?
Sure. So the story of the Black Lord is a family, mother and father and two sons, who wake up one day and their infant son, Danny, has vanished. They have no idea where he went. There's no clues about where he went. They just wake up one day and he's gone. Meanwhile, Eddie, the older brother, is visited by this strange creature at his window who tells him that he has Danny safe and sound. All he has to do is open the window and the creature will bring Eddie to Danny. And the story kind of just spills out from there. There's a deep, dark family secrets that come to the fore that become very relevant to the situation. And it sort of just devolves into a horrific, cosmic story of grief and dread and loss.
We've talked to you about the idea of it being cosmic horror, but it's also in the store right now, physically, classified on our little spooky shelf as folk horror. Can you explain the difference between cosmic horror and folk horror, and then why in the spooky shelf in the Village Well it's classified as folk, but I also know that you're a big lover of cosmic horror and H.P. Lovecraft and all that historically has entailed. So I was wondering if there's like where you see the overlap in your story and the differences between those two.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So folk horror, just like really broadly speaking, is horror that's comes about through folklore. It usually has a rural setting, usually has some kind of like mythology baked into the story itself. The designation of the Black Lord as folk horror was kind of a marketing decision more than anything else. I think it does have facets of folk horror, but the term is like pretty broad.
So it's like as if the Black Lord or the monster that's at Eddie's window is a semblance of a folk tale that we would.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There was one review that described the Black Lord as a forgotten folk tale, which I really liked.
I can see that.
Yeah. It does have that feeling to it, I think, of like something passed down through the oral tradition. Yeah.
It also, for everybody that will read this book, you'll experience this. But when I was reading The Black Lord, I imagined this bulbous figure, this bulbous monstrous thing that was a bunch of different monsters. So in some way, it felt like an affinity for Frankenstein, which I don't even know if you had. But that's the idea, I think. I guess I'm learning about folk horror in that way.
Yeah. It's a pretty amorphous kind of designation. There's a lot of writers who take umbrage with the term in general.
I don't umbrage with the term folk horror.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, just because folklore means a very specific thing.
I see.
And folk horror is kind of like a catch-all for,
and
rural woods-based, like pagan kind of storytelling. So,
and like folklore itself, like the Grimm fairy tales, those are in some sense folk horror. So it's like a redundancy.
Yeah.
But what is cosmic horror then?
Sure. So cosmic horror is horror based around the idea that we as human beings are insignificant and that the universe doesn't care about us and that anything could happen at any given time that you just snuffed out and it doesn't matter at all. So H.P. Lovecraft obviously is the sort of most famous example of cosmic horror, but he was not the first one to do it. The grandfathers of cosmic horror, to my mind, are Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, who also dabble in folk horror. Their cosmic horror is much more around the idea of nature not caring about us rather than like the universe at large.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. So a lot of their works have to do with nature rising up against humanity and snuffing it out in some way or another.
That's really cool.
So it sounds almost like folk horror is more describing the setting, and then cosmic horror is more describing the author's philosophy of the way nature or cosmology treats us with a objective thumb pressing us down.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction for sure.
It reminds me of the quote that Shatner had when he got to space, William Shatner from Star Trek. Do you remember this quote? I don't know it off the top of my head, but along the lines of like, I thought I was going to be encouraged by seeing the vastness of space, but I realized how insignificant we are and how, what do you say, even like suffocating that felt.
Yeah. When you go up into space, like just right outside the atmosphere, you can't see any stars. So it's just a black, infinite void. I imagine that would be really terrifying. And that's kind of the sense that cosmic horror hopes to catch, like, oh, we don't know anything. We're wildly insignificant. It does not matter what we do.
But then, and I keep returning to this in our conversation, all three of us, when we were preparing for this conversation, there's the feeling of being human in your storytelling and in the style of your writing that I think is so wonderful to read, even as somebody that doesn't dabble in horror and often gets scared of horror and therefore doesn't pick up horror novels often. But reading your text, I'm just right there with Eddie, and that's just. So my question is really, or my point really is like when you get to the feeling of being inside your characters, not just mind, but in the feeling that they're experiencing, whether it's one-on-one with the monster or just sitting there in the kitchen, that feels meaningful. And I think that's kind of the beauty of this book, The Black Lord. It's both cosmic and human.
Yeah, I think in many ways that's like the antidote to that feeling of hopelessness, that sort of vast insignificance, is to be in touch with your humanity, and more specifically to feel and express love. Like I talked about this when we did the book launch, but to me, the opposite of fear isn't courage or some random thing, but is love. You know, it's fear is shying away from the universe or from circumstances, and love is opening yourself up to it. So, you know, I don't want to get too spoilery.
Well, can you tell my favorite scene is that one scene after he's first faced with the monster, and he's sitting in his kitchen and he's hearing the sound of a buzz flying around, and then he starts to hear footsteps, and it's I sort of just want you to give like a little taste for that, like for whoever's listening. You know, what is that feeling of love that how did you find that feeling when you were writing, I guess?
Honestly, it's gonna sound like pretty woo-woo, but the characters did it for me. Like they showed me. Like, to me, if I'm writing correctly, the characters do whatever they want, regardless of what I want them to do. And so, like, in that moment with Eddie, you know, sitting alone at the kitchen table, and his father's walking around upstairs, and, you know, he's feeling this sense of neglect and disconnect. I didn't go into that scene with any preconceived notions about what he was feeling, what he was going through. He told me. I know it sounds silly. I'm sure there's lots of people who would roll their eyes at that, but
I think we're hopefully appealing to an understanding of artistry and giving over to that flow state as we pursue these characters. That's beautiful. I think my question, especially when it revolves around cosmic horror and what that means for you, how do you personally, or cosmic horror more generally, like reconcile that feeling of nihilism with love being the center of the human experience, and how that can actually like inform our life? Because I think, you know, when I think about that fairly nihilistic point of view, which is hard to ignore given our scientific understanding of the universe and the timeline of the universe, and how we're just this speck at the end, or Carl Sagan's, pale blue dot. How do you then reconcile that as an author, or maybe you can speak to the genre more generally, and like present love in an earnest way?
Sure. So yeah, I think it's hard to look at the universe and not think nothing matters. Like, we're insignificant. It doesn't matter what we do on Earth. Like, the most consequential people who have ever lived on Earth have died, will be forgotten. It doesn't matter. To me, that is freeing, because it allows me to make my own meaning in life. And I think that is really the key to getting out from under this sense of meaninglessness, or this sense of insignificance, is that if there is no meaning, then the only meaning that matters is the meaning that you make. And the most meaningful thing that you can do as a person is love. And so to me, the best that you can do to combat that feeling is just to love openly, to write about love, people overcoming adversity through love, and sometimes failing to do so too. I think that's also equally important, to show characters failing. And, you know, Todd has sort of a recurring, Todd is the father in the book. He has this recurring idea of failure, how he's failed as a father, as a brother, as a husband. And that failure is, again, I won't do any spoilers, but his sense of failure is super important to the conclusion of the story. And I think it's important to allow ourselves to feel that and to sort of got off on a tangent there.
No, I wanted to ask about how many. Well, now I'm thinking about the writing of it, and how many drafts did it take for you to get to a place where it felt like it was done?
Yeah, So the journey of writing this story was kind of unusual. I tend to pick things up and put them down, sort of not at random, but like when I'm feeling a piece, I'll work on it. If I'm not, I don't force it. I just put it away. So I started this book in 2019, I think, or maybe it was 18. I wrote the first 2 chapters, and I had no idea where to go from there. So I was like, all right, let's put that away. And then it wasn't until 21 or maybe 20 that I picked it up again at a writing retreat. I do this yearly writing retreat with 3 other authors.
And you just went on it, right?
Yes, I just got back from it last week. It was very productive, almost done with a new novel.
Wow.
And I wasn't really sure what to work on there, so I just picked up The Black Lord again, which at the time had a terrible title, which was Blue Eyes, Deep Water. Bad. I'm glad I changed it. But
I like Deep Water. That's a fun image.
Yeah, and that's sort of a recurring image
right
in the piece. But yeah, I just picked it up, and it's like it had been waiting for me. The rest of it just kind of just spilled out of me
at that retreat.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I finished it over the course of the retreat, and then a couple weeks following, and
wow,
it's more or less intact from that writing. So
so it was really just that draft, and then maybe some brush ups, or
yeah. So I finished the first draft. I did like a pass through by myself, and then I submitted it to Tenebris, and then I went through it again with my editor and just like little tweaks around the corners. But yeah, it was basically structurally the same from when I finished that first draft.
That's awesome. When you got to the point of moving that draft toward a publisher, as a first-time published author, like, are there any things that you learned in that process, or especially for any of our listeners who might be, hopeful published authors, and like, what was that experience like, and how have you grown in that?
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time on horror Twitter or X or whatever. I'm calling it Twitter until
we all know what that means.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was sort of plugged into the horror publishing community before I even submitted, and I just happened to see that Tenebris was looking for novella manuscripts, and it's like, oh well, send it in. And I knew they did good work. They had attracted some great authors and published some really cool stuff. So I knew I would be happy to work with them, and they liked it, so I sold it.
That's amazing.
That's great.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. When you look at yourself, 2-3 years ago, what encouragement would you give, given now the process that you've gone through?
Yeah, it's super pat, but just keep at it. Like, really just keep working on the craft and keep honing it, and just don't give up. If you really want to do it, you just got to keep doing it until something breaks through.
I love that, something breaking through.
Yeah, I think most people who have any, and I've had like very moderate success in the grand scheme of things, but it's it does feel good, and it's taken, like, I've been writing and submitting to stuff for 15 years or so. I got my first story published in 2015, so it's a long process, and its publishing is very, very, very competitive. So
at that first, was that a journal, a magazine?
It was for an anthology called Muffled Scream: Corner of the Eye, Volume 1.
3 titles. I love it.
Yeah, I don't think they ever had a Volume 2. But yeah, that was a long time ago now.
That's huge. That's amazing. Congratulations, though. That's quite the beautiful journey. And I think as the three of us are all creatives, I mean, we admire that so much. And that picture of breaking through, I think, ironically reminds me of light breaking through darkness. And tenebris is Latin for darkness, correct?
But yeah, our last question is, so a shelf talker is the little piece of paper that anybody that comes into our store will see on our shelves that recommend and give a little blurb about the book to encourage you to pick it up and maybe take it home with you. So would you write for us another or a shelf talker for not your own book, The Black Lord, but for a different book?
Sure. So if you like The Black Lord, I would highly recommend anything by Adam Neville, or specifically The House of Small Shadows, which is about a girl who is down on her luck, who takes a job as a caretaker at a mansion filled with dolls. And she quickly discovers that these dolls are not normal dolls. They are perhaps sentient and have malicious intent. It's absolutely terrifying. Adam Neville is probably writes the scariest books that I've ever read. So if you want like a genuinely scary book, anything by Adam Neville will do it. He just has his books feel like they're coated in a thin grime. Like you pick them up and they just feel slimy. Oh, it's so good.
Dolls are already scary enough.
Yeah.
Usually.
I have this one image in particular where the house is totally dark and she has a flashlight and she's like looking around and she flashes it on a corner and there's just a doll peeking around the corner and it just pops back around the corner.
I hate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely hate that.
It's rough.
In a beautiful way. That's awesome. And that is currently in our store right now.
It usually is, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Colin. We also want to plug that, this conversation or parts of it were covered in some ways, paraphrased maybe even, at our physical in-store book launch event. Thank you so much for this interview, Colin. Welcome back. This is the Culver and Duquesne audio newsletter here on the Shelf Talkers podcast from Village Well Books and Coffee. I'm sitting here today with one of my coworkers, Tom, who is the events manager here at Village Well. He's going to give us a quick rundown of the local events happening at the Village Well Books and Coffee storefront itself, as well as then talk about a book that he is reading, which will be the normal format of this audio newsletter. Tom, it's great to have you on the pod.
Dude, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, we're so excited to be here and look through the events page together and talk about what we've got. You're the events manager. You get to set up the events. I mean, that's been a really cool thing to work with you on. And even part of the way we've interacted with some of these guests on the podcast so far that we've recorded these episodes has been through your emailing and CCing. And it's just fun to see the different community. And I think you're a big part of the reason the community exists, that the events exist. So that's so cool.
Thanks, man.
So we're glad to have you. What events will be happening for the couple weeks after this podcast, this interview with Colin Hinckley releases? What's going on?
Sure. So tomorrow, as of today when this podcast comes out.
Which is which day?
Which is January 17th. The next event we have coming up is actually tomorrow, January 18th at 6 p.m. We're going to be launching Meme Holland's poetry book. Wow. It's called Year of the Cicada. It's about Asian diaspora and grief.
So just go cool to see. I think people don't realize how many events take place and how many readings and book launches. Yeah, I mean, people are like, how many events? They're expecting like a couple a month. And I'm like, no, probably 3 or 4 a week.
Probably
and they're
3 or
like,
4
what?
a week. People come up to me all the time. They're like, you guys do events? And I'm like, yeah.
You're like, that's literally my whole job.
Yeah. So this Saturday, we have a recurring event called Lit Angels, which is a literary journal, January 20th. 5 p.m.
Okay.
It's actually hosted by our good friend, Francesca Leah Block.
And Francesca's a friend of the store. She's written like a wild amount of books, which we get to go into on her podcast episode in a couple weeks. But she also has this great publication that she edits called Lit Angels, right? And they do their meetings at Village Well.
There's going to be a tarot reader there as well.
Tarot?
Yeah. Okay. It's a great time.
Cool.
Yeah.
What's next?
Next Tuesday, January 23rd at 6, we are celebrating the posthumous release of Catherine Min's The Fetishist with her daughter Kayla Min Andrews.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really cool story about her daughter kind of completed the book after she passed away. And, we're going to be celebrating it with McDowell. I think it's going to be a really good time.
Yeah, that sounds really special. That sounds like a cool thing to have.
Day after that is going to be our monthly comedy show, January 24th at 8 p.m. Supersets, which
Supersets comedy.
You performed at.
I have performed at. I won't be performing that night, but I have performed in previous shows.
It's always a packed house. Great show. Tickets are only $12. You can get them on Eventbrite.
You've promo code books for a discount.
That's
I heard.
Right. Yep.
That's huge.
True.
Okay.
Yep. And then on that Friday, we have Friday, January 26th at 7:30. We have an all-women open mic night hosted by our lovely friend Kate Burns, a local Culver City poet.
Wow.
Check it out if you're a musician, poet, storyteller, comedian as well.
Yeah.
On Saturday, January 27th at 8 p.m., we're going to have some live music with our friend Michael Monaghan, who has actually performed at the store before playing Irish folk music. I think he's going to do some more stripped down, intimate acoustic vibes.
Very cool.
Wow. That should be fun.
Music too. There's comedy, there's music, there's book launches, there's
all kinds
open
of stuff
mics. There's so much going on. And then what's the last thing on this list for this part of our calendar?
Well, so one of we're starting 2 new book clubs this year.
2 new book clubs?
Yeah,
this year?
Just this year, and so we are
2 new. So you're implying that there's already one.
There's one.
Whoa.
They meet the second Tuesday of every month at 6:30.
And that already exists. So that would have been last week for when this podcast releases.
Right.
That's led by our bookseller, Jacqueline. But now we've got 2 new book clubs launching this year. Tell us about one of them that's special to you.
Well, so I'm going to be hosting our sci-fi fantasy book club.
Wow. And which day was that?
Well, so that's going to be on January 30th at 7 p.m. It's going to be the last Tuesday of the month.
Okay.
Every month.
Wow.
And we're gonna read all kinds of stuff.
As long as it's sci-fi and fantasy.
As long as it's sci-fi fantasy, yeah.
That's so good. So what's the book for this month?
The book for this month is called A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, who is my favorite author in the entire world.
Have you read this book already?
I have, and I just finished the sequel too.
Oh, wow.
Fantastic.
What's the sequel called?
The sequel is called A Prayer for the Crown Shy.
Oh, wow. Those are all such good titles. I mean, that alone, the titles alone of those books feel like poetry.
No, it's a really cool aesthetic that she has kind of created. It's solar punk and hope punk. Do you know what either of those things are?
I know what solar punk is, but I've never heard hope punk because that's such a, I think culturally that feels like an oxymoron, the idea of hope punk.
Yeah.
But that's such a fun word. I mean, tease that.
Yeah. Well, so this is something I recently learned about, but, as kind of the pessimism that has, I think, dominated media for the last couple of years with COVID, like understanding.
Like dystopian type pessimism?
Right.
Yeah.
Hope punk is basically the response to that. So in this story is about a tea monk and a robot that kind of begin this unlikeliest of friendships, and it's about purpose and what it means to be human and humans' place within the ecosystem. And it's really short too. It's like 150 pages.
That's a pitch if I ever heard one.
Read it in like a weekend. So if you're interested in that.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know I mentioned that for this podcast, for the audio newsletter part, we would be kind of discussing, a bookseller's book they're reading or excited about. So I think with the launch of the Sci-Fi Fantasy Book Club, it's kind of taking the place of that for this episode. I mean, that sounds like such a great book for our listeners to get involved in, and potentially, if you read it by January 30th, to come to the book club at 7 p.m.
Come discuss.
Is there a newsletter for your book club?
There's
or like a specific email list that people could sign up for?
There is, yeah.
No way, there is?
If you want to email events@villagewell.com, you can get on that email list, stay up to date with the next book that we're going to be reading for that month.
That's great. And there's even another book club. If you're interested, we have an environmentalist book club as well. You said the first Tuesday of every month. The book that they read this last month in January was called The Heat Will Kill You First, which is a title that goes pretty hard. And so we got 2 book clubs launching. We've got a third that was already existing. We've got Tom telling us about a book that he's loving right now, A Psalm for the Wild Built. And this has been such a good time. Any parting thoughts you want to give for the listeners?
I just think it's very funny how the Sierra Club book club, this environmentalist book club, the book that they're reading is kind of the polar opposite.
That's funny.
That we're discussing.
That is funny. You're saying, one of them is like a discussion of how if we don't change things, there is very little hope. And then the book you picked is like, but what if we had a little bit of hope?
It could be better. You never know.
That's so true.
So just the range there, it's going to be great.
Absolutely. Well, this has been the Culver and Duquesne audio newsletter at the end of Shelf Talkers, a podcast from Village Well Books and Coffee. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being on the pod, Tom.
Of course.
We're so excited to see this podcast launch. Check the show notes for books mentioned in the podcast with Colin. Check the show notes for books mentioned in this section with Tom as well. And then, of course, go to the Village Well website. We have so many events, so many wonderful things that Tom puts together and we get to have at the store. And this has been the inaugural episode of Shelf Talkers.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.
This episode of Shelf Talkers is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee, was produced by Jared Kassabaum and Julia Elizabeth Evans, edited by Julia Elizabeth Evans, additional mixing provided by Akash Tumaluri, and our theme music is from Noah Vickland. Until next time, keep reading.